Los Angeles was a melting pot for all kinds of musical fusion in the 1960s, and the Rising Suns were one of the many LA bands that rode in on the folk rock train. And they were known mostly for introducing roots music to 60s rock, but what they were also doing, they were the first band to actually play blues rock, and we're going to trace their brief but influential journey here on Pop Goes the 60s.
Woke up this morning feeling sad inside, and though I'll never go back to her, I will never forget the girl. I got my 44 this morning, so long it hurt my shoulder sore.
Our story begins in Springfield, Massachusetts, where Henry Fredericks was the son of musical parents, his mother being a singer in the church choir, and his father being an Afro-Caribbean jazz arranger and piano player. Growing up in a musical household, Henry started playing piano, trombone, clarinet, and he did this until his father was killed tragically in a farming accident, after which he switched to guitar. And at this point, he started to also work on farms to make extra money. But eventually, he turned to music as his main source of income, changing his name to Taj Mahal in 1959. In 1964, Taj Mahal formed a duo with Lee Kincaid, and they relocated to the musical section of Cambridge near Harvard, where they started rubbing shoulders with Rob McKiernan, Al Wilson, and Richard and Mimi Farina. Now, Jesse, whose real name is Stephen Gerlach, was a fine finger-picking acoustic guitar player, and he had learned from the Reverend Gary Davis, who was friends with Jesse's uncle, who was Fred Gerlach, who was also a guitar player who had given some lessons to another young guy by the name of Ryland Cooder. Like many aspiring musicians in the wake of the Beatles' success in 1964, they moved to California, where Kincaid was originally from. And they started making an impact and started playing in some of the clubs there, like the Ash Grove, the Troubadour, and the New Balladeer, playing blues and acoustic music. Ry Cooder, who was also back in LA, would occasionally sit in with them at the Ash Grove. Now, the Ash Grove was a popular folk club that was opened in 1958, and some of the performers that passed through there were people like Muddy Waters, Mississippi John Hurt, Bill Monroe, Merle Travis, Johnny Guitar Watson, and Big Mama Thornton. By 1965, Ry Cooder was getting various jobs in the music industry, such as playing at the Teenage Fair at the Hollywood Palladium. Here he was in charge of the Martin booth and would give demonstrations on guitar and show off new products. And Cooder had invited both Taj Mahal and Lee Kincaid, along with a bass player that he knew named Gary Marker, and the four of them started playing Delta Blues, which was completely different than what the other groups they were playing, who were playing like the hits of the day and were dressed in suits and looked kind of slick. Well, these four guys looked totally different and got a lot of enthusiastic attention because of this. And their playing was so different and raw that they really attracted a nice crowd. So after that happened, they realized that, well, maybe we should be forming a group and go electric. They already had an inn at the Ash Grove, and Marker's uncle, Edwin Pearl, was the owner, so it was a shoo-in for them. They auditioned, and they immediately got a gig there. And they needed a drummer. So another frequent visitor to the Ash Grove was an older drummer who was like 20 years older than them. His name was Ed Cassidy, and he had played with all kinds of jazz players in the past. And with him, they formed a group called the Rising Suns. Now that they had a name, they started to rehearse as a unit. Now this is the lineup so far. We've got Taj Mahal here, vocals, guitar, piano, harmonica. Lee Kincaid, vocals and guitar. Ry Cooder on lead guitar, which included 12-string dobro, mandolin, and slide guitar. His first public appearance was actually at the Ash Grove, backing up Jackie DeShannon in 1963. Now Gary Magic Marker was playing bass, and finally Ed Cassidy on drums and percussion. Now Ed Cassidy, as I mentioned, was a jazz player, and he had played with some pretty heavy hitters like Cannonball Adderley, Art Pepper, Roland Kirk, and Jerry Mulligan. Though they were all seasoned players, they started to really gel as a group quickly, and word kind of spread, and especially among other musicians. They were true music buffs that frequented there, and a lot of musicians would hang out there. And Ed Cassidy said that it was a very good band that was very hot.
Silver buttons all down her back. Hi ho, you ought to know. She broke the needle and she can sew, walking and
Now, the first blow to the band was struck when Ed Cassidy strained some ligaments or tore ligaments in his wrist and could no longer play. He had to take several months off to recuperate, and apparently he strained his wrist playing an energetic performance of Statesboro blues. So he wasn't used to playing harder rock like that. I guess he was more of a jazz guy. But as it turned out, Chris Hillman of the Byrds, who was frequenting the Ash Grove, checking out the scene, suggested they look at his cousin Kevin Kelley. Kevin Kelley was a great alternative, and the fact that he owned a van didn't go unnoticed. Now, the Rising Sons are a good example of all the finest musicians, young musicians in the U.S. flocking to Los Angeles. And we see this with a lot of other bands, too, that formed. And in this case, the Rising Sons started to make some headway on the local scene, and they got some higher profile gigs, opened for the Temptations, Otis Redding, and Martha and the Vandellas. Now, they had a week-long engagement with the Temptations at the Trip, but this was a very difficult gig for them because the Temptations were obviously a super slick Motown act, and their following, they weren't really interested in hearing about sharecroppers and like Delta blues. They were into listening to, bands that wore fancy suits and rode Cadillacs. The young black music listeners that follow the Temptations, they weren't interested in that old roots stuff. They wanted the new Motown sound. So in this particular engagement, there was one show where only one person clapped for the Rising Sons at the end of their set. Now, things got better for them when they backed up Otis Redding. Now, Otis Redding was from Macon, Georgia, a Southerner, and he understood their music more, and his audience also understood the Rising Sons music better as well. We are now in mid-1965, and so you had the Beatles had been around for a while. Folk rock had just hit. The Byrds were getting big here with the fusion of Dylan and the Beatles. And record companies were looking to sign just about anything and anything new. So the Rising Sons were on a lot of people's radar. For example, Warner Brothers, Elektra, Capitol. The band started doing demos for these labels. Now, one of the persons that was very enthusiastic about the Rising Sons was Bird David Crosby. And apparently, after one of the Rising Sons gigs, he led the whole crowd in chanting, "Long live the Rising Sons." Now, David Crosby is known for trying to bestow upon everybody else who he found the latest and most happening group or performer. Like he did this with Joni Mitchell, he did this with Electric Flag, and this is just one of his moves. But what he also did for the group was something that was very fortunate, was getting them connected with Columbia and getting them a record deal. He was very complimentary of them and really worked Columbia to sign them. Producer Alan Stanton was the guy that actually signed them to the contract, and when they started doing some demos and some auditioning for Columbia just to see what they could do in the studio, they were doing a version of Traveling Riverside Blues, and Ry Cooder's playing slide guitar, and some of the guys at Columbia they had never seen that before. They didn't know what that was. So this was the first signal to the band that maybe we had chosen the wrong record company to sign with. Columbia was late to sign a rock band to their roster. I guess the first one would have been Paul Revere and the Raiders, and the Byrds in late 1964, I guess. And they had two big hits on their hands with those two groups. So Terry Melcher was the young hotshot producer that was producing both of those groups. So they gave the Rising Sons to Melcher, figuring out he would know what to do with them because he was young and spoke their language, etc. And along with Billy James, who was the Byrds' publicist, they were managing the Rising Sons. Now, the Raiders and the Byrds were quite successful, so Melcher had the confidence of the record company, but the Rising Sons were very different. They didn't really have anything commercial about them, so Melcher had his work cut out for him. The Rising Sons did a little bit of their own writing, particularly Jesse Lee Kincaid. Taj Mahal did some writing as well. And Kincaid's writing was a little more along the lines of Dylan with a little bit of Beatles thrown in, whereas Taj Mahal was blues.
Got a bird what whistle, I got a bird what sang. I will never forget the girl with green eyes. Some of these LA women so getting on my nerves. Sorry to tell you, but I really don't love you. You say treat you wrong.
Those songs were recorded in late 1965, and they were starting to work on an album and some potential work to maybe put out a single. Obviously nothing there sounds commercial at all.
Just a walking down the line, just a walking down the line. If the river were whiskey and I was a diving dog.
Walking Down the Line was a Bob Dylan song, and If the River Was Whiskey was just a blues song, and Columbia knew nothing about the blues, so some of these songs were really non-starters. And Melcher and Billy James realized that they were kind of in trouble here. They said, well, hey, we're gonna have to change this. We're gonna have to bring some outside writers in. And they offered to take the publishing from the band in exchange for this, and the band basically refused. Now, the band was a pretty democratic outfit. They didn't do a lot of their own writing, but the arrangement copyrights were shared. So that's one thing they all shared together, and they were pretty tight, but things at Columbia were not going well from the get-go. Now, the style that I called roots music, what exactly was this in the 60s? Well, I guess in this case, it was an early fusion of blues and rock. And the band saw themselves as an all-American band with old American values, hence the term roots. And they called it Delta Mississippi Blues, which was guitar-based with some acoustic playing and some harmonica. And generally, they added kind of the energy of the Beatles, which made it more modern. And that was their goal, to bring some of that older style roots music and modernize it. Now, not exactly knowing what to do with them because they were playing mostly blues, Billy James was hyping them as the American Rolling Stones, which clearly they didn't sound anything really like the Stones, but they didn't really know how else to market them. The label wanted to hear that, so that's how they proceeded. Now, because they had the contract with Columbia, they were able to get some TV appearances as well. Johnny Carson was one of them that they did. And then they even got a gig on a never-aired pilot for 20th Century Fox TV called The Sheriff, which was a contemporary Western featuring Gilbert Rowland. But that didn't happen, so Melcher brought in a song by Goffin and King called Take a Giant Step. Now, this is a song most of you are probably familiar with. It was covered by the Monkees on the B-side of their very first single, but the Rising Sons recorded it 4 months earlier.
Take a giant step outside your mind.
Now, Columbia demanded hits, so you can see why Melcher brought this song to the band. And even though it's very well done, it doesn't sound that commercial. It's well produced and probably would have charted somewhere in the lower ends of the charts. But they had some problems while recording it. Cooder, the lead guitarist, who didn't really have any pop sensibilities, struggled doing the solo. So just Lee Kincaid ended up doing the solo instead. Barry Hansen, later to become radio personality Dr. Demento, was on hand. He was a friend of the band, and he helped arrange that song. They were on the Dick Clark show Where the Action Is, and they recorded them lip-syncing to this song on the beach. And I guess it got to the white label promo stage and was released, I guess, it got out in San Francisco for a week or two before Columbia pulled it. And they thought it was a drug song, so they didn't want anything to do with that. So all this work went into this great song. They started doing television appearances, playing it, and Columbia pulls the song. So what they did instead, they just pulled a couple other tracks that they had recorded and put that out as a single.
Candyman, Candyman, been and gone, Candyman. I'd rather be the devil than be that woman's man.
Candyman was written by Reverend Gary Davis, and this was released in February of 1966. And as you might guess, it completely flopped because, I mean, I don't know how they figured this would have been anything commercial, but I think they were just desperate to get a single out after pulling Take a Giant Step. The band continued to perform gigs around the California area, and by May of 1966, Terry Melcher had them back in the studio. He wasn't giving up, and the band was continuing to improve, and they recorded several more tracks.
By and by, my sweet mama, mama, by and by.
In addition to By and By, they also recorded 3 Jesse Lee Kincaid originals.
Sonny's dream was sold to me for a proper shoestring, containing crystal bullets that will only pierce your heel. Yeah, I've been loving sheepheads out in the rain again. While I'm set to ride, she's going by my door.
Perhaps their finest moment in the studio was the recording of 210 Train, which was written by local songwriter Linda Albertano.
Riding on that 210 train, ain't never coming back again.
I had mentioned earlier that many musicians would come to the Ash Grove to check out many of the performers, and one of these groups were the Stone Ponies, and they loved the song 210 Train, and the Stone Ponies, of course, featured singer Linda Ronstadt, and they asked the Rising Sons if they could use their arrangement, and they recorded it on their first album in 1966.
And it's gonna be a long time, oh, till I hear the 210 train.
So the Rising Sons were one of the many groups that came through the Ash Grove, the other being the Kaleidoscope, I think, that were just fine players, and they would draw in musicians to see and hear them play. But these bands were just not commercial, and they couldn't really buy a hit. They weren't really meant to be commercial. They were instrumentalists more than anything, and that's what drew in the live crowd. And like the Kaleidoscope, the Rising Sons really struggled to have a hit single. So songs like Take a Giant Step and 210 Train are certainly worthy of release. And this is the album that would have come out probably had Columbia been able to get enough good material from them or had enough faith in them. This was released on Sundays in 2001, and here it's on the Columbia label. So this is what could have been. And this has got a nice track listing, pretty typical Columbia style liner notes in the back. Outlining each member individually, nice color photography, and a good track listing of their best stuff. Now, despite they were not releasing an album or recording another single, the band still was a popular live attraction. They started playing with other groups like Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs, the Daily Flash, Big Brother and the Holy Company, and Martha and the Vandellas. Now, they seemed to be fine live, but in the studio, I mean, Columbia, they had a problem with the integration. They had no idea how to market these guys. They just had no pop sensibilities at all. And they didn't quite know how to translate their live playing into something that was sellable. I mean, I guess they could have done a live album. That would have been an idea, but that was never even approached. So by the summer of 1966, things started to unravel, and they fired Kevin Kelley. And they replaced him with Frank Lupica. Now, they were playing and opening for the Sir Douglas Quintet at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, and Lupica made his debut there, but that was their last gig. So that was the end of the band. You know, everybody was kind of starting to go their separate ways. They knew this wasn't going to go anywhere, and there was really, Columbia didn't care if they left anyway, so there was really nothing to get out of. So unfortunately, they've just fizzled out, and not without being influential to other musicians on the scene. Now, the breakup came in late 1966. They realized signing with Columbia was a mistake. You know, maybe they had been better off with Vanguard, Folkways, Elektra. A lot of bands say that, though, in hindsight. And maybe they could have done a little more justice to the Rising Sons material. But really, I hate using this term, but I guess they were slightly ahead of their time. And another couple years later, I think they probably could have found an audience that would have bought their material. Now, clearly, this type of music started to come into vogue, I guess, just after the psychedelic period got over with, that fad came and went. And you had more, the Country Birds were doing roots-style music, Buffalo Springfield, Moby Grape, Grateful Dead. So all those bands started incorporating things that the Rising Sons had started. And I think that just, they didn't have the right combination of the right record label that would understood them, the right producer, and the right material, which is pretty much 3 strikes and you're out. So they were out. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the influence of the individual players. Let's start with Ry Cooder. Cooder ended up playing on Safe as Milk, the first Captain Beefheart album, and that's in 1967. It was released in August. He's probably most known for playing with the Stones. He plays mandolin on Love in Vain and slide guitar on Sister Morphine. And I've always credited him with influencing Keith Richards to the point where his guitar playing really took off after learning some of the different tunings that Ry Cooder taught him. And Cooder was a 6-time Grammy winner, and he has many solo albums and soundtracks to his credit. Now, Jessie Lee Kincaid wrote almost a folk standard in the song She Sang Hymns Out of Tune. And it's not that well known, but it was covered by Harry Nilsson, the Dillards, Hearts and Flowers, and Don Henley.
She sang hymns out of tune and carried a yellow balloon. She traded her love for a Spanish doubloon.
Meanwhile, Gary Magic Marker also played a little bit with Captain Beefheart. He was on some of the early production of Safe as Milk, and he's also on a couple songs on Trout Mask Replica, namely Moonlight on Vermont and Veterans Day Poppy. So he's playing bass on that album. His band Fusion formed in 1969 and recorded an album entitled Border Town, which also featured Ry Cooder. Now, Taj Mahal settled in at Columbia. He recorded 12 albums over the next 12 years or so at Columbia. And the first one was recorded in 1967, released in early 68.
I went upstairs to pack my leaving trunk.
Leaving Trunk is a great example of very early blues rock, and he's probably known most for making an appearance on the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus in late 1968, though that was never released at the time. Now, Ed Cassidy, drummer, he went on to form the Red Roosters briefly, and that became Spirit, and he was a founding member of that progressive rock band that had several important albums in the late 60s. Kevin Kelley worked at a department store briefly to make some money before being called again by his cousin Chris Hillman to play drums with the Byrds, and he played with them for about a year and a half in their country period in the seminal Sweetheart of the Rodeo album with Graham Parsons. And last but not least, Frank Lupica, with his one gig, he went on to play with the Sound Machine, Lee Michaels, the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band, the Travel Agency, Shanty, and the Steven Seagal Band before starting a solo career. Now, some 26 years later, this album was finally released, not in this form, but on a CD, and it was called The Rising Suns, featuring Taj Mahal and Ry Cooder, 20 plus tracks, and that was the recordings from 65, 66. And the only problem with that is some of Taj Mahal's piano was mixed out of the mix, and some of his guitar as well. So that's the only thing that's kind of lacking in these recordings. But there's still a great example of what was really going on in Los Angeles in 1965-66. It comes to mind, Frank Zappa had summed this up in the late 80s when he was asked about the industry and getting record contracts signed in the late 80s. His response was, and I'd actually play Frank Zappa's response, but I'll get a copyright thanks to his late wife on that. But anyway, he said something like, in the 60s, it was so much easier to get a record contract. And basically, he said the guys in the 60s who were wearing the suits, the guys that were running the record companies, the fat guys in the suits with the chomping on their cigars, they didn't really know what the youth wanted. So they were always eager to take a chance. They're like, well, I don't know, let's give this a shot. So that's how bands like the Kaleidoscope, the Rising Suns, even the Byrds, they got all these chances. They were something out of the norm. In the 80s, all these people that lived through the 60s, they became the ones running the show in the 80s. And they were not eager to give out record contracts to new sounds and new trends. They were wanting to repeat the success of the prior hits. So I thought Zappa made a very interesting observation on that note. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate all your support. I've got a website, popgoesto60s.com. that has a lot of groovy merchandise that you can purchase to help me support this show. I also have a tip jar if you want to do a one-time donation, or if you want to contribute in a bigger way, I have a Patreon subscription as well. So I'm already working on my next band video. You're going to see it here very soon on Pop Goes the 60s.